So I want to read this. So this actually was a tweet that was sent out a couple of weeks ago that I thought was really, really relevant for what we're going to do. So I'm going to read it out loud because I think it's a good one for us to sort of see. And so this is actually by an editor. And he wrote, he's a journalist, actually, an editor and journalist. He wrote, "There's a great mantra I learned in film school that I actually think is really useful advice for journalists, or I'll say in this case for authors. What he says is, story is structure. Since so many long-form articles I read are just, quote, anecdote dumps with no skeleton, cogent beginning, middle, and end, easy to lose the reader that way." And so what he says in there, just to sort of say it and like really nail it down, is story is structure. Now, many people think about this idea of writing stories or some of the creative writing stuff you're doing and think, I've got to be creative. And so there's this feeling that like you just got to like get yourself in the flow, and it's got to be like really, really like, you know, just emotionally charged. But the reality is that, again, what sort of Jason says here is right, is that story is structure, and being able to write stories in a powerful way really do come down to structure. So some of the stuff that we're going to be doing for the next month is helping you learn the structure of storytelling. And so the more we can get deeper into the structure of storytelling, the better. So story is structure, and that's truly the thing I think when you're actually writing your stories to learn, is that I want you to lean into the structure, because once you start to do it, it'll help you with those elements. So to have structure, though, you have to have forethought. And so that's one of the other things that I think is important. Just sort of sitting down with a blank piece of paper and trying to just write a story, first off, it's just not a very good approach. And second off, it really doesn't set you up to write a very good story. So that's why we have to have forethought before we do it. And that's where we're going to talk about the reason behind using the story inventory that I'm going to teach you how to use tonight. So we're going to spend some time over the next couple of weeks talking about some information from this book called The 7 Basic Plots. And it's written by a gentleman named Christopher Booker, so his book, or his research, analyzes thousands and thousands of stories to understand kind of what are the 7 basic plots that they have, which, again, as a little side note for you, I think it's amazing that a guy named Christopher Booker wrote a book about books, but nevertheless, that's why I think it's a pretty good that what he's done there. So we'll talk a little bit about what this means, but I want to sort of read this quote to you that I think is worth reading out loud again. He said, "However many characters may appear in a story, its real concern is with just one, its hero or heroine. It is he whose fate we identify as we gradually see developing that state of self-realization which marks the end of the story." And so that's the important thing to understand there, is that we have a hero in these stories. There's going to be someone that is the hero of it. And number 2, we're going to see that hero kind of having some lessons or learning. Those are the key things. And so if you break this down, we talk about story as structure. These are the 3 key elements. Number 1, every story has a hero. Number 2, every story has some kind of a lesson or learning that you want to show with that story. And number 3, you have structure behind that story. Again, those are the key things. And I think what many people fail to realize when they sit down to write a story is they don't sort of start from those places saying, who's my hero, what's the learning, and what's the structure that I want to use. So we're going to talk about that tonight, and again, give you some tools to do this more effectively. So what does it mean to be a hero? Who is the hero of the story? So these are some sort of key things to understand, is that when you're actually writing your stories, you want to identify who is that person I'm going to tell the story about. So a person, or your hero, is usually going to be a person. There's some cases where it could be an animal or it could be a company, but for the most part, it's a person. And so if you think about who that is, it's oftentimes going to be the person you interviewed, it could be the person you researched, or it could be you. Right? Those are the 3 people. The typical people that will be the heroes: the person you interviewed, the person that you researched, or you. Now, sometimes it could be someone else. Like, for example, you could write a story about your mother, and your mother's story could be the hero in this case, and you could be telling it in her behalf. So in that case, you may not have spoken to her, but you could use it. That could be a case where you could do it. But again, oftentimes you'll see that is what the hero is. Oftentimes the hero will be the one that has the most dialogue as well. So those are kind of some of the core places. The second one, the lesson and the takeaway. What is that kind of key lesson? Now, this is the important thing that I think is important to sort of say about structure. Story is structure, and that is this forethought piece. Whenever you have a story, there has to be a reason that you want something to be learned from doing it. And so what is the story going to teach you? And so it could be something that's, entertaining and interesting, like this is an interesting story, but in some ways we want to tell the reader something. We want them to take away from it. So these are some of the questions that I'll ask. Are the statements I want to make. I want this to be an example of blank. Like, what do you want this story to be an example of for your reader so they can understand something? Or, I learned blank from this story. What is that learning you had? Or, this story is interesting because of X, Y, and Z. So, as you're sitting down and kind of identifying what makes this story interesting or what makes this story valuable or entertaining, you want to understand what is the lesson. And then the last part of what we're going to try and do is understand the structure that we're going to use behind our stories. Now there's two parts that we're going to use. We're going to talk about one of them tonight and one of them next week. The first one is the 3Ds. We talked about the 3Ds. The 3Ds are dialogue, descriptive elements, and depth. Those three things. So when we think about our structure, we want to have those elements. Remember, every good story has the 3Ds. And then the second thing we're going to talk about next week is we're going to talk about the plots that we're going to use to tell the story. So remember, as Christopher Booker lays out, every story fits into one of these 7 plots. So if we think about the key things again, we understand who our hero is. Number 2, we start to identify what is the lesson, and then we think about structure. The 3Ds and the plots, that's kind of what makes it together. So again, we'll talk more about the plot stuff next week, but tonight we're going to talk a little bit about these pieces.